Oh, I see. There's an issue with Facebook. All right. So hang on one second. I'll just go ahead and remove that. Yeah, go ahead. All right. Facebook. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed that. Oh, I had to get rid of Facebook. Good morning and good afternoon to each and every one of our Merry Marvelites. As always, I am Christian Blatt, very excited for a very special episode of Marvel Movie Talk right here on Geekscape. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you watch on the Geekscape YouTube channel. That's where all the fun is. And subscribe over there to get our show, our regular episode. We will be on Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific, for our recap on episode 4 of Loki. But today we're talking about something that, if you know me, it's very near and dear to my heart. We're talking about the X-Men, and I'm joined by Andrew Deman, who I am actually talking to for the first time. I've never seen you before. I've heard you on other podcasts, but I've been following your Twitter account since definitely early in the pandemic. That's when I started following a lot. There's a great community of sort of, X-Men scholars in the casual sense. But in your case, Andrew, you're literally a scholar of the Chris Claremont Run, which, for people that aren't quite sure, that's the legendary 1975 to 1991 stretch that Chris Claremont did, which I believe is unrivaled, right? I mean, I think Dan Slott wrote Amazing Spider-Man for like a decade, that in more recent times, but I don't think we have anything that even comes close to that, do we, Andrew?
Not at Marvel, no. We've got Eric Larson's Savage Dragon, which doesn't
Sure.
maintain a regular schedule, right?
Yeah.
Which technically is more years. I don't know where it stands on issues, though. But at Marvel, not even Stan Lee ever made it more than 10 years on a book.
Yeah, so it's fascinating, and I've had the privilege to talk to Chris Claremont a number of times. I think he likes me for the simple reason that I really like his work, and but I've had great conversations with him, and my understanding from reading the book is that at some point in the process, you actually got to speak with him a little bit and get some background, right?
Yeah, definitely. I've done it twice now. I spoke to him at the start of this book, and I spoke to him again at the outset of a second book. That's what's the word I'm looking for? Submitted first draft at this point, and he is amazing. He will talk and talk and talk, and he loves his characters and his worlds so much.
Let me just interject for a moment. The most endearing thing the first time I talked to him, which was about a decade ago now, is the way that he talks about his characters. It was right away. He doesn't say Professor X. He doesn't say Wolverine. He talks about Charlie and Logan, and most of us call her Kitty. But he's Aurora and Peter, Kurt. He doesn't use their superhero names, and I don't think it's for show. I think he just doesn't think of them that way, and and to the extent that he's a great conversationalist, obviously he can talk about his work, his characters, the work that came before. If you get him on the right day, he'll tell you what he thinks about what they've done in the years since. And he has opinions. But I talked to him. So what year would that have been? 2018. And he just wanted to go off on some things about Star Wars: The Last Jedi. And I've talked to him about other sci-fi. He loves NCIS, the TV show. So
yes,
there's so much stuff comes out, and you're like, man, we talked about Magnum PI for like at least 5 minutes once. And I'm just like, I never know where the conversation's going to go. And his wife, who sets up his interviews for him, I always try to promise her I will try to get him done by a certain time. I'll try to keep it to an hour. And that usually turns into 2 hours and 40 minutes. So
yeah. Poor Beth. Beth is lovely.
She's wonderful and very tolerant. Yes.
Yes.
So anyway, so you got to speak with him a little bit on background. Talk a little bit more about that. Sorry, I just wanted to interject.
Oh, no, not at all. Just to your point, I will point out that his first novel, First Flight, is actually dedicated to the first names of his X-Men characters.
Yes.
Which is adorable.
Which I have that book. I have that book signed by Chris in 1993 at a comic convention back when signatures were free, but there was a limit. The sign said that he would sign 10 books, but at the top of my stack of many more than 10 was his book, and he signed his book, and he's like, well, you bought my book, I'll sign all these. And I was like, I wasn't even planning on that, so yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, so I talked to him specifically. One of the things I was really interested in was how he approaches storytelling. For me, one of the main questions was, does he approach it via plot or via character? Most people would assume character, and yeah, it's absolutely character. He won't do a plot if it doesn't advance the character arc somehow. And this is really cool if you go to his archive at Columbia University, where you'll see what seems like good plot ideas, because he has all these notebooks, right? And he'll be like, this person attacks from this location. And then he'll write underneath it, but what's the point for the characters? And like cross it out. And we never see that thing actually make it to print.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I know. I mean, you cite those notes a number of times. I can imagine it was interesting to see. Bringing in America's sweetheart, and in the interest of Andrew, he will one day be Canada's sweetheart. But Michael Shirley is joining us now. Michael, say hello to our guest Andrew Deman, and he is responsible for the Claremont Run, Subverting Gender in the X-Men. And we were just sort of getting started in the explanation of that. Andrew, talk about how there was actually a grant for you to study this work, and, this book, and you referenced the future book, are the result of that. But talk about how that process actually happens.
Very, very organically, I got a promotion, and I learned that I had access to research funds, and I had literally a weekend to figure out what I wanted to pitch to my chair as a research project. And I loved Claremont's X-Men, so I went into her office ready to like violently defend it, and I just said, I want to do Claremont's X-Men. She's like, oh, that sounds awesome. So that ended up happening. That became a grant proposal, which should not have succeeded, but did. So the federal government's like, here's some money to study Claremont's X-Men. And I was like, sweet. But as part of that grant proposal, one of the things that you usually put in a grant proposal is what's called a manuscript submission, which just means like, I literally don't even have to write a book. I just have to propose a book to a publisher, right? So it's like I might be able to do this. And then that happened to work out really well as well, because Frederick Aldama liked the pitch. And he's like, oh, you should bring that to University of Texas Press. And he did. He brought that to them, and they were like, okay, let's do this. So like it was a treadmill, essentially. I wasn't looking to write a book. It just kind of happened, and it was delightful the entire way.
Yeah. And by the way, speaking of the fact that the book is available from the University of Texas Press, I understand from a social media post that the book is already sold out in Canada.
We sold out in Canada by lunch, which was kind of
awesome. Is, I mean, just speaks to the demand. And because he heard the word lunch, I have to bring our other host, Eric Connor, in here, who I'm sure is still having more of these Loki dipping sauces from Chicken McNuggets. But I did a little screen grab of something you posted, Andrew. So the book. And I think that these are figures from Amazon here in the US, I assume. But wherever the figures are from, it's number 5 in comic and graphic novel literary criticism, number 12 in comics and graphic novel history and prices. But then number 91 in general gender studies, which I'm like, yeah, okay. Number 91 is, usually like, a band doesn't take out a full page ad when they're 91 on the Billboard chart. But the idea of how many books on gender studies there must be, the fact that it's in the top 100, I'm like, wow, did you expect the reaction to be what it has been thus far, Andrew?
No, and those numbers are from yesterday. This morning we were number 3, number 2, and number 22.
Wow! All right,
which is stunning.
I'm glad I already got my copy. I don't have to wait for it.
Yes, collector's item.
Yeah, I know you can't see it because of the background. That's why I have this, Michael. So we're definitely going to talk about all that. I just wanted you to kind of set the stage for how this comes about. And the Twitter account that I started following, which is just at Claremont Run, I guess technically that's called X now, but people know it as Twitter. And there would be these long threads, and it obviously caught my attention because you would use panels from the comics to sort of elaborate on it. And you did a number of videos about some of my favorite characters, which we'll start to talk about as we go around. So the idea of a book was sort of always there, I guess. Is that the case, Andrew?
Yeah, no, the book was very easy to write, having been like what I did was I was writing the book while maintaining the Twitter account. So it's kind of cool to be able to, like, first draft ideas on Twitter and get feedback and hate in some cases.
Some cases, yeah.
Some very positive reactions. And a lot of those sort of inflected the final shape of the book, which is lovely. I will always think of this as a Twitter project more than a book project, though, in my eyes.
Right. And I need to ask about some of the work that goes into it, because, you'll give quotes like, Storm was visually more represented than Wolverine during Claremont's run. Storm shows up 4,155 times to Wolverine's 3,520. She's on 97 covers. He's on 89. And then for our visual audience, I actually have this right from the book. You'll have charts like this, which is depictions of physical contact, non-combat by character. So the simple question is, how? How is all that counted? How is it quantified? Are there just documents for, like, this is the Gambit document, which is obviously going to be shorter than the Wolverine document?
Yeah, I should first point out I'm a dumbass English major and I'm really bad at math. So this was a really massive labor. With the federal grant that we got, we were able to hire 4 research assistants, some of whom are very good at math. Like, one of them currently works for Google in New York City and stuff like
nice.
That. So we were able to, I sort of designed a process, and then they would go off and I would make these young people read these very old comics, and then I would gather the data and try to figure out what it meant.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. And, I posted some links in a few places, the fact that we were going to have this conversation. And, there's different levels of nerd. It's like, oh, I like the X-Men cartoon. I like the movies. Oh, I really like the comics. And then it's like, oh, I want to read a book like this that talks about, representation in terms of, character representation, but also just the sheer numbers. So Cami Egan, one of our favorites in the chat, wants to know if the book is available at comic book stores. I believe it's probably not, but I do know you can get it on Amazon. She's in Chicago, so it's not sold out in Chicago. It might be sold out in Canada, but she should be able to get it on Amazon, right?
Yeah. See, this is, again, my ignorance. I have like no idea how exactly UTP works. Right. I would assume that there's some hard copies of the books available in bookstores. I could be wrong about that. They could be working exclusively through online distribution. Yeah. I know that makes me sound even stupid.
No.
I was just
like,
here's the book.
I'm letting her know where to find it. So I want to bring our co-hosts in, and we'll sort of go through characters. And I think I know who Michael's going to talk about. His hair today represents who I think is the character that you want to talk about. But Michael, obviously, there's a big focus in the book, Andrew, on subverting gender and X-Men. And we'll talk sort of about Claremont's work in terms of, how he stands out for his depiction of women. But let's talk about the characters themselves for a little bit. So, Michael, if you're going to isolate an X-Men character, one of the female characters, who do you think you start with first, Michael?
Jean!
Jean Grey, yes. And we get lots of Jean Grey throughout the Claremont run. And it's interesting because she was a very different character, whether it was Stan and Jack or it was the Neil Adams run. But pretty quickly, I mean, she is just completely different. So, Michael, when you think of Jean Grey, it's probably not Marvel Girl, where everyone on the team, including the professor, is secretly in love with her. Not creepy at all, by the way. So what is it about Jean for you, Michael? And then Andrew will kind of speak to a little bit about that representation.
The hair. I always love redheads. Oh no. Her power set for me sets her apart from everyone else.
But specifically the Phoenix power set, or are you even thinking more
just
like
her
90s?
general, like, I mean, if I had my choice of any X-Men's powers, I would pick Jean's, like, to be able to move stuff and like read people's mind. You could just like sit at home all day and just work real hard.
Yeah. And there's, it is interesting to think about, obviously, because she was this, incredibly strong character. And Andrew, one of the things that I didn't realize until I was reading your book, as she becomes more powerful, not everyone within Marvel is happy about that, correct?
Yeah, very correct. I don't want to be mean to Jim Shooter because Jim Shooter actually did some really important things with the Marvel editorial office in terms of bringing in female editors, most notably Louise Simonson, actually. But he had this thing where he felt that if a prominent male villain or male hero even were to lose to a female character, that would be emasculating, so he wouldn't allow it. And
right.
He had this.
So in the book, you mentioned that Chris wanted Jean or the Phoenix to fight Thor and Silver Surfer, both of whom she obviously could have beaten.
Yeah, very easily.
Yeah.
Either of them, and both times he was rebuked. So what he did was he had her fight Firelord, who has beaten both Silver Surfer and Thor at this point. And she stomps him. It's barely a competition.
Yeah, good old. I believe Spider-Man even beat Firelord when I was reading in the early 80s. Is not all Heralds of Galactus were created equal. Eric and I earlier today, Eric, you actually sent me an image that Andrew mentions in the not the usual kind of images. It's not anything from our text thread. I'm glad you differentiated that.
Yeah, it wasn't after 10 p.m. Central Time. No,
but Michael, but Eric, you actually sent me something that Andrew highlights very specifically. A scene. This is when Jean, I think she's Dark Phoenix at this point. At the very least, she's Phoenix. So you talk a little bit about why you sent the scene, and then I'll ask Andrew to sort of elaborate on why it was highlighted in the book and why it's so important. And our visual audience will see that panel right now, except I have to move us around that way.
For you non-wireless listeners out there, first, by the way, Andrew, thank you so much. And it was a really, really interesting read as far as I kept thinking about all your assistants as I'm looking through this. I recently was on, I stopped by my friend's studio where they're filming Lego Masters. And there's someone whose job it is at the end of the day, or more than one person, to organize all the Legos that have been used. And we're talking in the millions. And I kept coming back to that visual when I was like reading some of the remarkable amount of data. But I think you also did such a nice job of contextualizing data. Sometimes these studies can be a little bit, I call it bloodless, where it's like the data can be interesting if you're into data. But I think what's really a nice hook about this book is it always went back to the emotional stakes. It always went back to really how gender was represented, how Chris Claremont took, decades of very conventional comic book writing and sort of blew the roof off of it with his approach. And this one scene here you pointed out is they did a little bit of a facsimile of this in I think it was X-Men Last Stand, where he
we don't talk about that movie on this show, Eric. Come on.
The X-Men Who Shall Not Be Named.
Okay, thank you.
When Scott's visor comes off and she at that point, Dark Phoenix, I'm not sure I'm allowed to even call her that, it uses her power so he doesn't blast her into nothing. And that's what this moment here is from the comic. And I apologize, I think it was X-Men 170. I had the number.
No, she's dead in 137. So
okay, so she was alive in this. Okay,
it's definitely prior.
A little earlier than that.
Yeah,
but this moment here, what I really liked in your writing about this was you're talking about Phoenix actually being I guess I use the term loosely, but the aggressive one in this moment. Sort of take off, open your eyes, Scott, nothing will happen. And imagine Dark Phoenix with my voice, never a sexier image you could have. I'm telekinetically keeping your optic blast in check. I wanted to see your face. That's all. You have a good face. I love that panel so much. And this moment here is everything. And also the idea that Phoenix is taking charge. She's telling him, stop thinking about the job and let's get down to business. But I thought this panel really spoke to so much of Chris Claremont's work. So I was wondering, in terms of focusing on this, if you could expand on that a bit, Andrew.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think this is such a, like, if there's one page that defines the Scott-Jean relationship in Claremont's X-Men, this is probably it. So it's this idea of you've been slowly exploring Jean's power creep and the, let's call it gendered tension that it creates with Cyclops, who is the leader of the team and is the man in the relationship by the standards of the era that they're existing in. And all of a sudden his girlfriend is a goddess and like kind of has to patronize him a lot to maintain his sort of fragile ego. So you have this scene where she's completely in control and like she literally tells him to hush. He's a man who can blow a mountain off of its like actual foundation. And it's just shush, in order to get what she wants.
Don't speak.
And it's such a sexual agency scene too, because usually Jean specifically, going back to like Silver Age X-Men, she's a trophy. She's what you get if you win the battle and Professor Xavier thinks you're a good boy who obeys orders well. And she's not that here. She's, again, in complete control. She knows what she wants and she takes it. And she's clearly trying to appease him a little bit. She's talking to him kindly. But I think it's really obvious who's the top and who's the bottom, so to speak, even though she's on the bottom.
Yeah.
By the way, it's from, sorry, Christian, it's from X-Men 132.
Yeah, that
Uncanny X-Men, of course.
Well, I appreciate. Well, yes, of course. That's the sort of the interesting thing is, as we're sort of talking about the differentiation, she's not reborn, but the return of Jean that happens in the 80s, which we have talked to Chris about a couple of times, and how unhappy he was with it. He doesn't really write that Jean nearly that much because she was in the pages of X Factor. Not that he didn't write her at all, but she wasn't a mainstay in the book for most of that time. I mean, towards the end, she was there, and she's in the first 3 issues of the volume 2. And I think it's interesting because that version of Jean is really not the one he wanted to do. I mean, he thought that X Factor should have been Jean's sister, which I think from a story standpoint works, but from a marketing standpoint, I guess not. You have strong feelings about Jean's sister, Michael, or are you?
What, Elaine Gray, is that her name? I forget.
Sarah.
Her
name was Sarah.
Yeah. So I think that, but the Phoenix outfit is one of the best costumes. And I always think it's interesting because they have tried so many different Jean costumes over the years. More recently, she went back to the Marvel Girl look, which was never a favorite of mine. But it really always comes back to, like, even when she doesn't have the Phoenix Force powers, they're like, yeah, but there's one that looks really cool. And I mean, the green version was created by Dave Cockrum, of course, but, and then, I mean, the Dark Phoenix one is basically that costume, but red, but, still that's from the John Byrne part of the run. And it's hard to really beat that. She never has anything that even comes close to looking as cool as specifically the Dark Phoenix one, but even the regular Phoenix green costume is a good one as well. So yeah, it's very interesting to sort of examine the character because you have to do a few different stages. There's the before the Claremont run, there's, then she dies, and then there's, of course, after he leaves. When you're going through this, Andrew, so I think it said it's about 380 comics. So what exactly does that entail? I assume it's not New Mutants, it's not Excalibur. What exactly are you quantifying when you're looking at these characters?
So we had sort of two samples. The one was the sample that we could analyze qualitatively, so the reading, and that would include New Mutants, any annuals, anything like that he read. But in terms of building the data sets, what you need for that is a stable sample, which means you don't want to do things that are a little bit different or under a different editor or just ways that might be discontinuous kind of messes with your sample. So for the data collecting, we specifically isolated Uncanny X-Men 97, which is when Claremont first really starts, to 278, which is when he goes away. We didn't include the annuals. We didn't include New Mutants or anything sort of surrounding that. But in terms of like the things that we could talk about, the things that we could analyze, the stories that we could fold into this sort of context building in the narrative, basically anything that Claremont wrote between 75 and 91.
Right. And obviously there's, periods where he comes and revisits these characters. But I think the important thing was to focus on what I think a lot of people refer to as, the classic run, because the initial run is really the one where all the stories for the movies and TV shows came from, basically. It's like everything that we've seen on screen basically shows up in there. I wanted to talk a little bit about Claremont's representation of women, which obviously is a huge, it's the primary focus of the book. And, I don't need you to go into the figures, which are in the book, but compared to just other Marvel comics, Claremont having these strong female characters, talk a little bit about that and how it really was the outlier for the time period.
Yeah. I mean, it was landmark. The big stat that I can throw out is that based on our numbers, he was Bechdel testing 42% higher on average.
Right.
Than the rest
And
of
let me
Marvel.
just interject that because I did want to turn into that. So the Bechdel test is two female characters having a conversation, not about a man. That's the short definition of what that is. Yeah. So, and I think that, look, it gets applied to things sometimes very unfairly. And, I think it's not a barometer of necessarily whether or not a story is good. However, it was very interesting to see just how many instances there are of that in this, 380 comic sample size, right, Andrew?
Yeah. And I think that's really the simple conclusion that kind of spurs the initial inquiry in the book. He was just meeting a bar. A very simple bar, as you said, a bar that doesn't indicate quality, but the absence of clearing that bar consistently across thousands of comics does indicate a problem. So for him to be kind of that far ahead of his contemporaries shows things like that he's got more female characters, that he's letting them talk more, that he's letting them talk to each other more about things that are different. So he's cultivating those female characters, I guess, is sort of the easy conclusion that we can take from that.
Right, absolutely. He doesn't just introduce them. There were always female members of the Avengers. I'm talking about in the same time period, and they were not always very well developed. I mean, there would be issues where I believe Carol Danvers would say nothing. In the lead up to number 200, I think that they didn't remember she was on the team. She was just there in the background, and I tried to get out of Claremont some of his real thoughts about the way that Carol Danvers was treated in Avengers 200 and just dispatched, and how basically he had to make good in Avengers Annual 10 to kind of make her the character that we think of now. But enough time had gone by, and it was just like, well, you'd have to ask David Michelini, and then he just stopped talking, and I'm like, all right, guess I'm not going to get that out of you, but you could tell it still bothers him. They really did that character wrong. However, enough so that he came back to fix it. I talked to him when the Captain Marvel movie came out because I thought it was important to focus on that aspect of her. In the book, you have a couple, there's a lot of great visual representation in the book, things from the comics. But in talking about the perception of Claremont around Marvel, you reference a couple of things that I remember one of them really well. This one, I think, is from Marvel Fanfare. And this is, I believe Al Milgrom did this. And there's a lot of words in these bubbles, so I'm not going to read all of them. But it's basically just this idea of, like, oh no, Claremont's here, and you don't actually see him in this one, but for our visual audience, this panel right here on the far right, that's all Claremont talking. So the idea is that he talks the way he writes, and he wants to make the point about representation. And one that sort of surprised me, but I do remember reading this book, Strike Force Martori, which how they haven't developed that intellectual property into something yet surprises me. But there's a poster on the wall that says, Claremont says, "Is there any reason it can't be a woman?" And so this guy's looking and says, maybe it'd be a good idea if we named her Dominica. So obviously this is sort of, this is definitely tongue in cheek amongst other Marvel creators, but he was really the outlier in a way that he maybe shouldn't have been, where it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to write strong female characters. And then it's like, look at this guy, huh? He wants to have all the girls in the books. What's that? It's called X-Men, buddy. So talk a little bit about that as you sort of explored this topic, just this idea that, he's not really being ridiculed there, but they're definitely poking fun at him.
Yeah, that's kind of the sense you get. Sean Howe talks about it in his book on Marvel as well. Yeah, no, his mom was a pilot, someone who worked for the Royal Air Force, and he was inspired by her, and he thought that he's seen badass women, and he wanted to see more of them in print. So he immediately comes in. He takes Jean Grey, this sort of quiet, what's referred to as point and pose powers. You know what I mean? Where she does like this, and then that's it.
Yeah, I mean the easiest comparison is Sue Richards, the Invisible Girl, eventually Invisible Woman. She also had point and pose powers. Like, well, I can be invisible, and then I can use my invisible power. I can kind of move stuff. But yeah, she's not really attacking people.
Yeah, she's not getting her hands dirty, I guess is the easiest way to describe it. And he immediately takes Jean. Like, we're talking issue 99, what is essentially the Phoenix Saga starts. And I think most people who've read the books will tell you that there's really no differentiation between the Phoenix Saga and the Dark Phoenix Saga. It's just kind of a continuous story. And you can draw the line wherever you want in terms of where it starts. We know where it ends, but where it starts is extremely fluid. So anyway, yeah, he takes her and he makes her a goddess. First thing he does. And then after that, he makes Storm incredibly powerful, gives her leadership of the team, brings in a bunch of female characters that comics had completely given up on. Dazzler, Psylocke, they were gone. Nobody cared about them. And makes them awesome intellectual properties that are still in play today.
Yeah, and I mean, he even sort of in the era that I'm about to show an image from, I mean, it's obviously there's these strong female characters. Dazzler's a perfect example. I mean, the last issue of her solo series says, "Because you demanded it," the final issue of Dazzler. And I always thought it was like, they're like, oh, they're bitter about the fact that we didn't want to buy it. But his editor, Ann Nesenti, created with Art Adams, Longshot, Mojo, Spiral, which are eventually become such huge parts of, this Claremont lore, his run, and they're such great characters. And I think that, the Longshot miniseries and those characters are consistent with the way he uses them, but it's easy to forget for a moment that those aren't actually Claremont characters. He just was able to sort of embrace them. But the reason why I was bringing up this image is because I already touched on the fact, you talk about the fact that Storm is clearly far and away the character most represented throughout this run. And there's short stretches where she's away from the team. And even despite that, she is still even featured more than Wolverine. Did that surprise you, Andrew, when you found that?
Yeah, I think it did. I think I was expecting Wolverine to be a lot more central, but I think that was one of the real emerging conclusions that I was facing as I undertook the project. Just everything runs through Storm. She's the viewpoint character. Every time that her character undergoes a major change, the book follows suit and undergoes a major change as well. So if there's one character who's deciding what direction we're going in at any given time, it's going to be Storm. And even when she does leave the team, they actually made an entire Beast story about her pilgrimage to Africa, which is not the most superhero comic worthy story, especially for a character who literally doesn't have superpowers at that time. Comes back and becomes the leader of the team again without superpowers.
Yeah.
No, she's everything to Claremont, and I think she's everything to understanding the fundamental movements of the plot when you perceive it as this macro story, as Claremont very much does. He's been very open about it. This is one continuous story.
Yeah, and she really stands out in a lot of ways. And I want to ask Michael and Eric. Michael, I want to ask you first. So obviously, you're a Jean guy through and through. But talk a little bit about Aurora Monroe Storm, and sort of the different looks she has, but also just your thoughts sort of on the character in general, and maybe why somebody like Chris Claremont would spend so much time really developing that character, Michael.
Yeah, she's, I don't know, in my opinion, she might be the strongest person on the team mentally, maybe not physically, but mentally, she's the one that I feel like always has the most level head. Like when Cyclops is all caught up in all of his stuff, she can kind of toe the line. You definitely see it in her outfits. They're very bold, they're very showy, but they're also, aside from the mohawk, they're pretty feminine, but they kind of have this like strength to them, and almost regal, especially in the beginning. That outfit is she kind of looks like a queen,
Yeah.
I feel like he picked her to kind of do this because that's the person that no one would really kind of expect you to, a black woman, from actual Africa. I feel like that was kind of right in line with what Chris was doing.
Yeah, I mean, he's handed this character, Len Wein wrote Giant Size X-Men #1, where these new X-Men were introduced. So, in that book, she's living. People think she's a goddess. She knows she isn't, but she also has sort of, and Andrew, in the book, you talk a little bit about the spiritual background. I guess that Claremont's first wife was practiced the Wicca religion, and so some of that comes through in Storm. Talk a little bit about that, Andrew.
His first wife, Bonnie Wilford, was very into Wicca. Claremont's talked about this just a little bit. He's been a little evasive on it, which posits this kind of it's Gardnerian Wicca, which is a British branch of Wicca, and it posits this sort of divide between the horned god and the mother goddess. And Claremont's Storm was often the figure of the mother goddess, the idea of this person who can bring destruction, similar to Jean in Dark Phoenix, actually, but who is also a life giver at the same time. And I think a lot of those symbols inflect Storm like very directly. You'll get references to her being magical at one point in a New Mutants comic, to being of a sorceress lineage. It was definitely something that he was using to give her sense of power, because Wicca is a very feminine, empowering religion.
Yeah, no, I think it's just the depth in from which her backstory changes. There's the first comic where we first meet the Shadow King, I think is Uncanny 117, and there's the backstory of her as a young pickpocket, and that's when Charles Xavier first meets her, and you get that, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the, it's not even the later part of the run. It's like, the midpoint of the run, just the big changes that the character goes through. But Eric, I wanted to kind of give you a moment to have some thoughts specifically as they relate to Storm.
Storm is someone that's funny. I feel like we've, in Marvel Movie Talk and Geekscape, give Storm so much love and respect. I think for Christian and I, we're close in age, but
you're older.
I am older.
I saw that coming.
You sure did.
Listen, I got you that Loki sauce. Just remember that. All right. This was like the X-Men that hooked me in, not just to X-Men, but to comic books. as a kid. So in essence, Claremont was already up and running as the writer on Uncanny X-Men, and that was the comic I always went back to. Always found myself connecting to, going through probably stopped collecting around 13 or 14. And Storm was a character that I always found so fascinating because of these things you guys just brought up, and this idea of like what her powers were, but really it was about her presence as a character beyond the powers. And I think that's the thing. And I know this isn't obviously about the MCU, but you read about her, and even you brought up Sue Storm before, and think of, I would say, the less than favorable treatment she received in her cinematic adaptations. It's like you have these remarkable characters, and they even got an Oscar winner to play one of them.
Yeah.
And yet somehow they have not even come close to tapping into, in the case of really either, but for our purposes here, Storm, what Chris Claremont did, month after month for years. And I remember when Michaela Cole, I think that's how you pronounce her name, got cast in Wakanda Forever, there was a little bit of a kind of a chatter that maybe she's playing Storm. And she was not. And I mean, there's lots of wonderful actors. I mean, to me, to this day, if they could find a way to get Angela Bassett into this character,
that's what Claremont wanted.
And especially think about when she did What's Love Got to Do with It?
Yep. And that's the era. Yep.
Oh my God, she would have been so perfect. And so there's definitely actors who could pull it off, but it takes writers willing to kind of meet Claremont's vision kind of halfway even, and they've come nowhere close yet. And hopes, except for maybe the cartoon. The cartoon, I think, did a better job.
I think the cartoon, it's definitely easier to approximate what you had from the comics. And in terms of Claremont's ideal casting, he mentioned it more than once when I've talked to him, is the fact that he thought the perfect actor to play Wolverine would have been Bob Hoskins, because that's how he envisioned him. And obviously he's even said he loves what Hugh Jackman did, but that was the way he was thinking at the time. But Angela Bassett in that era, or even now, would be a great
still pull it off. Oh my God,
But they've got other stuff for her to do. In reading about Storm, Andrew, you reminded me of a story that I probably read once. A lot of the early part of this Claremont run, I would read month to month as they were being reprinted in a book called Classic X-Men, because those comics were all very expensive and they hadn't done a good job of collecting them at that point. So I would read Classic X-Men, but because comics were only 17 pages in those days, there were some great background stories. I've talked to him about a couple of them. There's like the initial plan for who Mr. Sinister was going to be, what his backstory was, which ended up getting changed. But you see that in a Classic X-Men backup. But you talk about what I remembered reading as I was reading you talk about it. It was sort of this fascinating idea where this character named Phil is basically a surrogate for Claremont, right, Andrew?
Oh yeah, no, it's he's introduced as a weary pulp writer who's been loyal to the company and is a massive fan of Dan Dare. Like, that only describes Chris Claremont,
Right, exactly.
And he goes and he's going to kill himself because he's tired of the company grind, which is awesome to have somebody write that in a Marvel comic. And what saves him is Storm.
Yeah.
She shows up. And if that doesn't speak to Storm as Claremont's muse, I don't know what does.
Yeah, I mean, he's literally put himself into the story.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's basically he's thinking about jumping off the roof of this building, and that's when she sees him, and it's like, oh, okay, so she's like literally saving his life, which I don't know, it's so interesting, and those, I believe they've been collected, but those backup stories in Classic X-Men, I mean, some of the things that they really delve into the Jean and Logan backstory in Classic X-Men #1, which had been touched on in the books then, but certainly not even hinted on in the 70s at least. So there's definitely some retconning that happened that it's like all considered part of the lore in this day and age. And I wanted to ask you, Andrew, before you started the project, and since we're primarily talking about female characters, but was there, my favorite X-Men character that I'm the most interested in heading into, even before maybe you even had the idea for the project? Who did you think stood out, and where did they measure up when you actually started, quantifying how much, I was going to say screen time, but how much, panel time they got?
Yeah, I think so. My favorite X-Men character as a child was Colossus. And I really liked a lot of the sort of idea of this like violent bruiser with the soul of an artist, who maybe doesn't have intelligence but does have emotional intelligence. That was cool to me. And I got into this project, and I don't think Claremont liked Colossus very much. He didn't write for him very much.
Well, he didn't Thunderbird him.
Yeah,
but,
it could have been worse.
Yeah, which I mean, and that's a fascinating thing that Thunderbird is the first. I don't know, as far as I can think of, he was the first Native American Marvel character, and Claremont kills him off after 3 issues. But his explanation is like, well, he's basically the same as Wolverine, less interesting powers, same demeanor, less interesting character. I didn't want 2 of them, but and it's like more than a decade until they basically bring his brother Warpath along, and they're like, oh, let's try this again. But it's sort of fascinating. As I was reading that, I was thinking about like, oh yeah, he gave Thunderbird 3 issues to live.
So I have to defend Claremont a little. It was mostly Dave and Len who decided that Thunderbird was redundant, and Claremont claims that he opposed it.
Okay.
And that he was mad about it thereafter, which is actually why he brought in James later on.
Yeah.
And maybe also to some degree why he created Danny Moonstar, who's a really good Indigenous character, through whom Claremont really explored something that I think comics had probably never explored with Indigenous characters, at least in the mainstream, which is the idea of modernity for Indigenous people. Like if you have an Indigenous comics character, they're going to have a feather and they're going to use a bow and arrow. And yes, Moonstar sometimes does both those things.
Yeah.
But Moonstar also talks about what it's like to live on a reservation, what it's like to go to a shopping mall, what it's like to be exposed to the racism of students in her class. So there was some really cool stuff he did with Indigenous characters.
Right. And that's a good point, I guess, because those, you said that your official characterization of the run starts in issue 97, and Claremont wasn't really in the driver's seat quite yet. Those first few, I guess, Len had plotted those or whatever, and he just sort of
I think Marv Wolfman helped out too. But
yeah.
Claremont's first like independent, I am the writer of Uncanny X-Men, issue 97.
Well, I'm sure, Michael, if we're talking about individual characters, you're probably not even remotely surprised by who I'm going to bring up next, Michael. If we're speaking about female X-Men characters, I'm going to talk about the character that when I was a kid was always my favorite, probably because she was the easiest to identify with. But I will always have a soft spot in my heart for Kitty Pryde, also known as Shadow Cat. And for our visual audience, I'm showing a sketch that I had Dave Cockrum draw for, I believe, $20 at a comic convention in the late 80s in Middletown, New York. He was just sitting there with his wife, Patty, who he worked with a lot. And he threw in Lockheed. It was $20 a character. And I was thinking about like, it'd probably be cool to have him, pencil and ink Wolverine. But I'm like, but that's not my favorite character. So he drew me this Shadow Cat, which isn't even from his era. But the fact that he threw in Lockheed, I was like, I feel like I got a real discount in there, But Kitty Pryde is such an interesting character, and probably because of the age of the character, Claremont is probably way more protective of her than some of the others because of how other creators have treated her. They've had her get older so that she could date grownups. There's a lot of things that he's talked about. Other writers come in and they change something about a character, and then the old writer comes back and immediately changes it back. It's just sort of, I guess, the way it goes when that's the world you live in. But talk a little bit about Kitty, who, of course, you mentioned Danielle Moonstar, who is, of course, a strong female character, but she's also, of Native descent, Native American. But Kitty has the advent of also being one of very few Jewish characters, even today in comics. You know, I mean, there's like the Israeli superhero Sabra, and I don't know a lot. I mean, I guess Ben Grimm is Jewish, right? But there's not many, right, Andrew?
No, this has always been the weird thing because the Marvel bullpen in the 1960s had a whole lot of Jewish representation amongst the creative staff. Ben Grimm was known to be Jewish. Everybody knew he was Jewish, but he was not canonically Jewish. Kitty Pryde is identified as the first canonically Jewish superhero at Marvel Comics.
They had just to interject, they had Ben Grimm finally get married to Alicia Masters at some point, I think within the last few years, and he wore a yarmulke to the wedding, and that was where I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense, of course. You know, but as a kid, no, you're right. It was like if you assumed anything, maybe he was Italian. You know, because he grew up on Yancey Street, you know, and all those ruffians. But anyway, sorry, back to what you were saying, Andrew.
No, just this very kind of clearly a character coming from a different background. Again, you have the Jewish element in terms of the importance of that representation. You have the youth. This is not a new thing in comics. We've been doing child sidekicks since literally the 1930s. But having this character come in immediately after Jean Grey dies, like literally she shows up while they're at her funeral.
Yeah, she's like she takes a cab to the mansion and she's waiting because there's no one to let her inside. It's like, well, and the cab driver's like, all right, well, we'll just leave this 13-and-a-half-year-old outside here. And
but you have a 13-year-old kid who is extraordinarily vulnerable in a situation that has just been rendered very vulnerable because you've taken away the plot armor because Jean has died. That's really cool. And all of a sudden, all of the violence and trauma that the X-Men are exposed to directly or indirectly gets seen through the lens of a child who is in no way emotionally or physically equipped to deal with it. That creates a really amped up tension and a wonderful sense of vulnerability in a narrative that superhero comics don't usually have that, right? The sense of vulnerability isn't usually there.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, you know, there's for our visual audience, there's obviously the very memorable Professor Xavier is a Jerk, which is the title of Uncanny 168, where she kind of logically gets punted over to the New Mutants. I mean, there's members of the New Mutants. Most of them are older than her. So it kind of made sense. But she obviously proves herself and she ends up back on the X-Men. But, you know, I always liked the dynamic between her and Ileana, who, when we first meet Ileana, she's a little girl, then she's a teenager, and then she goes back to being a little girl, except that's not during Claremont's run, I think, when she ends up being a little girl again. But correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew. I think that's Scott Lobdell that turns her back into
just after.
Right after. Yeah. Yeah, but Eric, I want to also ask you about, you know, other characters as well. But Eric, specifically, I wanted to give you a minute to talk about Kitty Pryde. For, you know, people who maybe don't know, Eric, you're Jewish, and there's not a lot of characters in Marvel. Was there something special about Kitty because they took the time? I mean, in her first appearance, she's wearing a Star of David necklace. You know, I mean, it was never like later on they're like, oh yeah, let's do this. Let's change this about Kitty. You know, I mean, she's one of the only Jewish characters, right?
Right. Wait, and what you're bringing up, Andrew, as far as like, you had a lot of Jewish writers working in comic books for decades. Just like you had a lot of Jewish writers working in Hollywood for decades and decades since the birth of it, really. I mean, half the names are, well, transformations of Jewish names, like mine is, you know. And I think what happens, though, is this thing like where the actual religion very seldom makes it to the screen in big Hollywood films. Very seldom made it to the page of the comic books. And I could understand, I think, sometimes, you know, and this is a larger discussion of, you know, what it means to be, you know, a minority in America, what it means to sort of, are you Jewish American? Are you American Jew? And this is the kind of debate that has gone on since, you know, I don't know, since Columbus, I suppose. And I think, you know, they found a way with her to sort of bring it organically to the surface more. You know, we talked about this a little bit with the recent run of Moon Knight on Marvel, you know, on Disney Plus, because, you know, that one obviously it pulls a bit more because of its settings. Like there's a moment where he's, you know, sitting Shiva for, I think was his mother Christian or his father who passed.
I believe it's his mother, because
Yeah.
his mother, well, for lack of a, his mother goes through some mental health issues in the series.
Right.
Yeah. Yes.
And so it's like him, like falling to his knees with the keep on his hand. Like there's something really powerful about that. But again, I think it's always that balance of getting it to the page when it makes sense, not leading with it. And you could see even now the blowback that the character of Sabra is getting in this, the New World Order movie that's being developed, speaks to lots of politics I know we're not going to get into here, but just like there's
not on this show, no,
not on this show, no. But there's always that concern, I think, and I get it.
Yeah.
I think it's like you don't want to let these sort of like religion or politics, which are always complicated things to bring into any form of education or writing. You always got to be careful of it overshadowing everything else going on. But again, I think that's why I liked with Kitty. It's like it didn't feel, like such a big thing. It's like sometimes it takes, oh yeah, I forgot she was Jewish, But I think that's the thing you're always looking for, is the sense not of leading with one word as in Jewish or Italian, but rather it's part of the character, but it doesn't define the character.
No, she's much more defined by her ninja training, which we get in the Kitty Pryde and Wolverine. I mean, that's such a huge part of the character, especially subsequent creators. But we don't focus on the subsequent creators too much over here. Michael, as we're talking about, X-Men characters, specifically some of the females, is there anybody? There's one that I know that I feel like you might want to talk about, but is there anybody that you feel like we haven't talked about enough that really stand out to you as strong, powerful female characters from this Claremont era of X-Men, Michael?
I'm surprised the name Rogue hasn't been mentioned at all.
Well, now you can.
Yeah.
You take it, you run with that Rogue.
I mean, especially the way she's developed, and I referenced in passing Avengers Annual number 10. That's her first appearance, and she is, definitely a villain character who steals Carol Danvers' abilities and memories, and she's so complicated, and it's definitely sort of this controversial character that's brought into the X-Men. Controversial within the pages. I don't think the fans were upset, but there was like Wolverine was away in Japan, and it's like, her, well, if Charlie says so, I guess so, but I'm pretty sure she tried to kill me, only like 6 issues ago, but whatever. But
no,
what is it about?
Perfect.
Yeah, what is it, Michael, about Rogue, though, that obviously that makes her somebody who should be at the forefront of a conversation like this?
Well, I'm trying to think, and she's really the only character I can think that represents a strong Southern woman in the X-Men. She's got, I don't know, Rogue is like, even from her hair to her outfits, I feel like Rogue is always portrayed as kind of like a badass.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think that, the amount of time that Claremont's able to spend with Rogue, and, she really becomes the character that I think a lot of people do discover her from the animated series, but people really get to, she's so different than when you first meet her, even when she's first in the X-Men. I mean, she is this public enemy number 1. And she's the character. She's this mutant that the government wants so badly to take the powers away from, that they develop technology that will take away mutant powers. Except, of course, not everybody's as good a shot as they should be. And then they take away Storm's powers. And I mean, Andrew, it's years that she doesn't have her powers, right? I mean, in terms of not narratively, obviously, it's arguable as to whether or not this entire Claremont run is more than like 3 years in terms of the story. But for like, it isn't until like the Outback era that she gets her powers back, right, Andrew?
Yeah, just before that, in Fall of the Mutants, actually,
which is the image I'm showing right now is Fall of the Mutants. Yeah, so right before that, and I mean, and there's nothing more humbling if you're Cyclops that you lose leadership of the team to someone who doesn't have their powers anymore. But really, the focus should be on what a terrible father Cyclops was. That's really what, and I will always have to point out it's not Claremont's fault. That's editorial. That's Bob Layton, right? That's who insisted on X Factor being the original X-Men, which I don't know. I was reading comics at that time. I was not clamoring for the return of the original X-Men. I liked the new X-Men. I didn't need them to come back. I didn't need Angel to show up in a monthly book. One of the characters that I want to touch on from later in the run, but who's popularized in the 90s cartoon, was somebody who was the X-Men character that really stood out to my wife and her sister, who were Chinese American growing up in Orange County, and that's Jubilee. So even late in the run, Claremont is introducing these new characters who are checking some other boxes that he hadn't before. And I didn't realize that she's one of those characters that people kind of are very dismissive of because, and I'm not, Michael, I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk about when she later on becomes a vampire. That's not Claremont related. We can do a special on that if you'd like, but we're going to just talk about the Claremont canon version of Jubilee. And I mean, in a lot of ways, it's like, oh, she's kind of like Dazzler, really, but it's that dynamic that is something that's always important for storytelling with Wolverine, you know, whether it's Kitty or the issue that I always isolate, Uncanny 205, it's Katie Power from Power Pack when he's lost his memory and he's wandering around in the snow. There's always this paternal nature for Wolverine, and, you know, Jubilee sort of with Kitty going off to England for Excalibur. I think that it was the perfect time to introduce a character like that. But talk a little bit about, I don't know, anything, Andrew, really, that in your analysis, anything that stood out about Jubilee.
I think the intersectional experience that you mentioned, the idea of, I mean, X-Men from Giant Sized was created to be a series of stereotypes of nationalities, right? Claremont didn't like that. He immediately made Storm African American as opposed to African. He made Wolverine less of a lumberjack under the surface, and a few other kind of things along those lines, right? So Jubilee is a character who is of Chinese descent, but also through and through American, right? So there's this layer of complexity to that. There's this character who is all bombast and confidence and charisma. She's literally a con man. But beneath that, a very vulnerable character, a character who is still a child, who's had their childhood largely taken from them, who can burst into tears at any given moment or flip you off. And you don't necessarily know which one you're going to get. And pairing her with Wolverine at a time when Wolverine was at his most vulnerable was really cool, because she becomes his caretaker despite being a teenager herself. And he teaches her stuff. That's obvious. He's got the knowledge and the wisdom. But she's clearly desperately alone, and she clings to him with such force that it's almost toxic. It's almost codependent, but at the same time, it's kind of beautiful. And I think that complexity again in the relationship is wonderful.
Yeah, and there's a moment. It might actually be in the solo book. It might be after Claremont. This might have been Larry Hama might have written it, but there's a point where he has to like leave her behind, and it's always. You know, he didn't usually let you know he was leaving. It's just you get up in the morning and like, oh, I guess Wolverine's gone, huh? But that, you know, so their bond, I think, was stronger than a lot of the other ones we had to explore. I want to get to some comments from the chat, but before we start wrapping things up, Eric, I know you put in some time reading the book, and it seemed like you enjoyed it as much as I did. I wanted to know if there was anything that we haven't touched on that I'm going to use air quotes, that your homework turned up that you wanted to pose to Andrew.
Yes, Mr. Blatt. Thank you, Mr. Blatt. So much of what I read in this, you're bringing up, Christian, like your wife and your sister-in-law and their sort of experiences connecting to a character like Jubilee. So my wife, Lauren, has a very different kind of circumstance, which is she's surrounded by a lot of big, dumb men. Me, our two dogs, and our two sons, who are not so dumb, but they're getting big and they're getting pretty hairy now. And so thus she goes to a lot of these movies, hears a lot of very geeky, nerdy talk amongst us. And what I really enjoyed in your book, Andrew, you brought up so much of the stuff that drives my wife nuts in the good way you brought up, meaning talking about the Bechdel test, which is something we've actually taught our kids about at a pretty young age. But even something that, and I don't know if you had a chart about this, but it was connected to one of the charts about ripped clothing and how often the women were portrayed. And I actually grabbed an image. Hopefully you can see it somewhat okay. This is actually Padme from Attack of the Clones. Yeah. And the idea that she could get her shirt ripped so perfectly in her midriff.
And not hurt the skin.
No, why would you hurt the skin? the muscles, look at the washboard abs.
Hey, Natalie Portman worked really hard for that, all right?
Yes, she did, just like I worked hard for mine in a very different way. And so I think like what you've done here with this book, which is great, and right up there on the title, Subverting Gender, I think you really sort of sing the praises of Claremont, but also I think you do a nice job of putting a spotlight on things that, I mean, honestly, a lot of men might not really think about, and I think like, it is a running joke in these movies whenever two women talk about something that's not a man. I go, hey, Lauren, look, they're talking. Look, they're talking. They're not talking about men. And she gets annoyed every time because they're like, just wait. And lo and behold, usually she's right, that give them a minute. But I think like so much of what you did here that's really great is like I said, it's not just numbers. And I have such respect for the depth of the research you did here. I mean, it really is astounding. But just giving it a good emotional context. And I think also, too, for anyone out there who is thinking of writing, it's like these little reminders of like the power we have with the choices we make and sometimes the choices we don't make, and I think you did such a nice job of just reminding at least this reader what Claremont was able to do with Marvel for years to bring it forward before a lot of his contemporaries were in TV writing or film writing. I think Claremont maybe was a step ahead in a lot of places. So I really appreciated the work here, and it's one that I'm actually going to convince my wife to read as well. Although it's hard, her Marvel diet's pretty full, but I think she might make an exception for this.
There's a lot on the menu. Well, Eric, I know you have to go. We'll finish up in a few minutes, but obviously, if people want to continue the conversation with Eric Connor, he's Count Eric Connor. And Eric, we will see you on Friday when we're talking about Loki episode 4, sir.
Oh, Michael, I can't wait to see how happy you'll be.
He's already rolling his eyes. Yeah.
Andrew, thank you again. It was a great book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Oh, wait, sorry. I was kicking you out of the room.
Yeah, as you're kicking me out. Cammy Egan, I was going to suggest buy a bunch of the books. Buy a bunch of the books, go over the border to Canada. You'll make money. Make sure Andrew gets his cuts. That's all right. Bye.
Contraband.
All right. He's solved it. Yeah, that's funny because when I was in college, we had a friend who lived close to the Canadian border, and he'd bring down like Molson with a higher alcohol content. So this is sort of like the nerd equivalent of that. Daniel Drew in the chat, we were talking about Cyclops earlier. Scott didn't have the best father himself. Corsair, the Starjammers. He's not a particularly great dad. I have to agree on.
He's a cool dad.
He's a very cool dad. Yeah, absolutely. Daniel had earlier asked, other than Claremont loving character development, of course, is it possible that there just weren't many other teen, young adult female characters that weren't mutants in Marvel at the time? I mean, I know what you're saying, Daniel, but there's no shortage of female characters. We're talking about the mid 70s, I mean, I think when Stan, Jack, and Steve Ditko are starting, there are far fewer. But by that point, I mean, Spider-Woman had her own book. I mean, it lasted for like 4 years, but she still had it. You had Ms. Marvel. You definitely had this explosion of diversity. You had a lot of female characters. You had Shang-Chi, who really lasted until the 80s. But I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I guess, is that maybe what you found, Andrew, that there should have been better representation because of the characters who were out there? But maybe just and I feel like at some point Marv Wolfman wrote Spider-Woman, and Claremont did eventually, as he did with Ms. Marvel. But were you surprised that maybe the creators responsible with some of these other female characters weren't doing more?
Yeah, a little bit. I think I was expecting it somewhat, just because it's the world we live in, right? And I think a lot of it is kind of editorial decision. If you decide to hone in on a target demographic that is the teenage boy demographic, that's going to affect the way that you view stories, right? And that'll trickle down to the writers.
Right.
So there's a little bit of that going on, I think. I think Claremont was clearly coming in with a mission. Like he flat out states it in some interviews. He says, I want to write strong female characters because he doesn't think other people are doing it. So in some ways, he's a response to that, which I think is kind of interesting too. Not just that he wanted to do it sort of innately, but that he recognized that absence, that gap. The one that surprised me a lot was the Frank Miller Bechdel testing. Miller wrote 2 arcs that were about Elektra and Karen Page, and not one of those issues passes the Bechdel test. Like not one. That's intense.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's a specific test that Karen Page fails, which is don't give up your boyfriend's secret identity for a hit of crack, you know, which really spoke to me when I read that. I don't know, I was like 11 or 12 when I read that. I'm like, what? Like, you're his friend. But I mean, Frank obviously Miller, one of the strongest Marvel female characters would be Elektra, or so you would think. And yeah, that was one of the things that I read. That was early in the book. I was surprised. Sorry, I've got a cough, and there's really not much I can do about it. Michael, I want to talk about, as we wind down, the other character we alluded to. We talked about how Claremont had a habit of kind of picking up some discarded characters. Talk a little bit about Dazzler, Michael, and why she's amongst your favorites.
Oh, I love Dazzler. I have every issue of that series. I like her because she's a rock star. Mm-hmm. You know, like that was such a fun thing to me to see them bring in someone that you wouldn't really, you know, they've already got a career. Like, why would they want to save the world? You know, Dazzler's got some of the best costumes. I feel like she was very much perfect for, you know, the 70s, and just, you know, the way she initially appears.
The roller skate disco Dazzler.
Yeah,
I love that look myself. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I really kind of fell in love with her when I started playing that old X-Men, Uncanny X-Men video game. She just kind of, her power set where she throws, you know,
photon grenade.
Yeah, like it really kind of, I don't know, I feel like she's the strongest character in that game, and I think that's really speaks to kind of the way Marvel was at that time, and it still is in many ways, or at least the X-Men, the way they were, you know. It makes sense that, you know, one of the smaller female characters will be the best, you know, most loved character in the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's that, you know, pop star, rock star thing I find so interesting, that she cares enough, you know, to be part of this team when she could just be out there making money.
Yeah, I mean, not a Claremont story, but there's the Marvel graphic novel Dazzler the movie, where she was one of the first people that comes out. You want to talk about problematic storytelling, but there's that moment where she's basically outed as being a mutant, and I thought that was an interesting sort of dynamic, because, you know, mostly the X-Men, you didn't really know who they were, but the people who needed to, I guess, all knew who Charles Xavier was. But I think, I always thought that Dazzler was an interesting character. And I believe Psylocke is a character he created writing Captain Britain, right, Andrew? But
like not even recognizable. Like literally, she's just Brian's twin sister, Betsy.
Right. And you know, there's some, you know, there, I mean, obviously there's so much that can be talked about violence to female characters. I mean, there's that term from the Green Lantern story when you fridge a character, where literally the character's body ends up in a refrigerator. But, you know, Betsy Braddock becomes Captain Britain, and she's so overmatched. That's how she becomes blind. And, you know, I guess that's another Carol Danvers situation, where Claremont's like, look what they did to this character. Now I have to kind of bring them back. And in her case, let's make her Asian, which, you know, look, definitely was a very cool look. And especially for the Jim Lee period, you know, I mean, that look for her. But even the sort of the 80s look, where I don't know what else to call her other than the British Betsy Braddock. It was an interesting addition, the character, I thought, and I think that she fit in well to this era where it wasn't literally this, but I kind of remember the mid to late 80s being where the X-Men were a group of female characters and Wolverine. I mean,
yeah, more or less.
Yeah, but essentially, because you sort of had Havoc and Longshot, but for the most part, the characters that the focus was really on were the female characters. Well, Andrew, I enjoy the Twitter account for years now at Claremont Run, but reading the book, I just didn't realize what a hot commodity this book was, or maybe it's just south of the border. It is
undersupplied.
But,
I don't know.
Yeah, but I let's hope they print more, and I assume you can get it for like the Kindle and stuff like that too, though, right? I mean, I would hope so. So yeah, even our audience in the Great White North, as they say, you can still get the book. You just can't hold the book. And they sent it to me digitally, but then they asked if I wanted a physical book, and I'm like, oh yes, please. I wasn't going to ask for one, but when they offered, I'm like, I much prefer to read it that way. So I hope if people have been interested over the last hour plus, they check out the Claremont Run, Subverting Gender in the X-Men. And Andrew, I referenced at Claremont Run, but I know you have another project. If you want to tell people other places where they can find your work and what you're up to these days.
I'm sure. I think the easiest method is to Google me at this point, just because I've done a lot of stuff. But I have another social media thing called Sequential Scholars. Yeah. And I co-host a podcast called Gosh Golly Wow, which is all about the Marvel comic Excalibur.
Yes. So, they're closing in on the end on that show, right? Because there's
10 episodes left.
Yeah, there's like 130 issues of Excalibur. And I remember I mentioned that in passing to Claremont one time, and it was almost like my grandfather would hear something and just go like, "Oh, geez," the idea was just like, "Oh my gosh!" But yeah, that's a fun show. I've contributed when there've been sort of milestone issues, like, oh, come up with a caption for this panel. So I've done stuff like that where I've submitted those. That is a fun show. You're at the point where. Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
Is that the podcast where each episode is an issue of the book?
Yeah, and we bring on like a comic scholar. So it's a bunch of like nerds being real nerdy.
It's very nerdy to go issue by issue through Excalibur, which was obviously not the best selling mutant book of the era. But you're well past the part where I was reading it anymore. But it's definitely interesting to see what was going on in the late part of the run. The run of Excalibur, as it were. So just Google J. Andrew Deman, Deman, for our audio audience, and you should be able to find him and his work, and of course the book, The Claremont Run, Subverting Gender in the X-Men. This show will be back at our regular time on Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. Talking, I'm sorry, Michael, about Loki episode 4, but there's only 3 more, so we'll see how it goes for you. Some of us will have been enjoying it at that point, but we'll see how Michael feels. And please make sure, wherever you're watching or listening to this, make sure to subscribe to the Geekscape YouTube channel, because that is the only place you'll be able to find our show going forward. I know we did a couple of simulcasts on my YouTube channel, but go to Geekscape, GeekScape TV on YouTube. I know I don't need to spell it, but I'm spelling it anyway. Anyway, thanks again to Andrew and everybody in the chat with some great thoughts. We will see you next time. And as the great Stan Lee would say, Excelsior!